welcome to part 3 of Aisha's world famous discovery program, brought to you for the first time ever online. You're in for a treat today. We're going to get there just in a second. I want to read you a quote just to start things off. This is by a man named Milton Himmelfarb, who is a social scientist, and he said the following thing. He said, "Every Jew knows how thoroughly ordinary he is. Yet time and again, we find ourselves caught up in things great and inexplicable." So I don't know about you, but that sentiment rings awfully true to me. If you look at the world today, no matter what we do, Jews seem to find themselves in the middle of controversy. People are constantly paying attention to us, both in a good way and oftentimes a bad way. What is the reason that we are so considered so often and in such unusual ways? That is what partially the Discovery Program is coming to address. It's making the case that there is something extremely unique about us, and that somehow that is tied to the nature of our famous book, which is the Torah. We are setting forth the audacious claim that the Torah has a divine origin, a transcendent origin, and furthermore, that is possible to prove through science, mathematics, logic, history, so on and so forth. So in week number 1, we did look at Jewish history. We saw 7 anomalous ways in which Jewish history is completely unlike any other. And furthermore, that those anomalies were predicted thousands of years in advance in the Torah itself. Last week, we had Harold Gans, a senior cryptologist for the Defense Department of the US government, who showed us mathematical he's a statistician, and he used statistics to explain to us the anomalies of the coding within the Torah that show us, in seemingly in impossible ways, that there is in fact codes written in the Torah that could not possibly have been put there by human beings. This week, we are going to be looking at the origin claim of the Jewish people, how our religion actually started. In order to do that, I'd like to bring on my friend and colleague, Rabbi Gluckin, right now.
Oh, look at that.
Who is apparently at Woodstock, which is appropriate because there were hundreds of thousands of people there. Is that correct?
That's the reason why I chose this background.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're going to see how Jewish origin story is also completely anomalous, and hopefully take another step in our journey. I will leave it to Rabbi Gluckin. Please enjoy.
All right, everybody, welcome. My name is Rabbi Gluckin. I am broadcasting to you live from the holy city of Boston, Massachusetts. Any Boston fans out there? Probably. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the national revelation, or what I like to call a funny thing happened on the way from Mount Sinai. Can I share my screen, my slides? How do I do that? There you are. Look at that. All right. So a funny thing happened on the way from Mount Sinai. So what we're doing, we're asking, like Rabbi Jacob said at the beginning, we're asking the audacious question: can an intelligent, thinking, rational, level-headed person really believe that God wrote the Torah? God wrote a book. And as we spoke, we're gonna, I believe this was in the introduction to part 1. We're making a distinction between what we call deductive proofs and abductive. We're making a distinction between using deductive reasoning and abductive reasoning, meaning the distinction between something X happened, then there's Y. X happens, so it must mean Y, as opposed to X means that it's likely that there's Y. And the way we're going to do this is by examining evidence. So we're going to look at evidence, and we're going to be judges and not lawyers. The difference between being a judge and not a lawyer is that a judge is not necessarily emotionally invested in the outcome, as opposed to a lawyer who is. We're just looking at the evidence. We want to see how this thing plays out. And there you go. So here we go. We're going to start with a story because everybody loves a good story. And then we will get into a little bit of the claim. All right. You with me so far? I hope so. Okay. So once upon a time, there was a king. And this was an older kingdom back wherever it was. And the king was an absolute monarch, but he was a kind of benevolent ruler and everybody loved him. And as the king was getting older, getting into his 50s, let's say, he started stressing about his line of succession. Who's going to be the next king? Who's going to come after me? So this king had 3 sons, But in his kingdom, it wasn't necessarily a done deal that the oldest son would be the next king. So he's thinking, okay, I've got my oldest son. Maybe he would be a great next king. Maybe my second oldest, who is he's the minister of finance in my current government. He would be a great choice. My youngest son's a warrior. Maybe he'd be a great choice. And he's trying to think which one of my sons would be the best. And he thinks about it and he talks about it. And there's different factions within the court and the palace, and people have different opinions. And some say it should be the oldest, and some say it should be the middle son. Some say it should be the youngest. And they're having all these conversations. And anyways, this goes on for a while. And everybody knows that this is the main topic that's on the king's mind. And anyways, one day the king is sitting there in his study. And he's just thinking to himself, who should be the next king? Should it be my oldest son, my middle son, my youngest son? And in the middle of thinking about it, he dies. Whoops. Okay, so what do? Turmoil in the kingdom. He didn't pick his successor, and people are not sure what's going to happen. Is it going to be? So whatever. Anyways, in this kingdom, they happen to have had a custom where it was a 30-day period of mourning for the last king. And then at the end of the 30-day period of mourning, the new king took the throne and they went on with their lives. And so since he hadn't picked his successor, so there's a lot of conflict in the kingdom because each son wanted to be the king. And so the different factions in the palace started getting a little bit more intense. And they started writing editorials in the newspapers and hanging up big posters on the streets. And they closed down the stores and people started marching and arguing, and it was getting really intense. Anyways, they're getting towards the end of this 30-day period. And one of the brothers, he locks the doors to the palace and he calls a meeting with his other brothers and he says, guys, you're never going to believe what happened. And they're like, what? And he says, last night, Dad came to me in a dream. And guess what he said? He said, you're the next king. All right, there you go. I'm the next king. You believe him? Do you believe him? Is he lying? Maybe, maybe not. Can you prove it? Maybe, maybe not. If I was one of the brothers, I would make the following claim. I'd say, look, you're my brother. I love you. I know it's been really intense for the last few weeks, but whatever. Bygones be let's let bygones be bygones. Here's the thing. If Dad really has the power to appear to people in dreams, wouldn't it make more sense that Dad would come to all three of us and say you're the next king? If you come to the whole court, the whole palace, the whole nation, if you came to everybody and said you're the next king, wouldn't that make a lot more sense? It'd be weird. It'd be supernatural and hokey. I wouldn't necessarily want to accept it, but okay. It's a lot better than me just having to take your word for it. That's the idea. The case is like this as well. Pretend you are God. Now I have a slide for this. Pretend you are God. If you're God, same thing. If you're going to give your book to a group of people, for whatever reason, who knows whatever reason you've decided to give this book, would it make more sense to give it to a lone prophet in a cave or in the woods or out in the desert by himself, or to give it to the entire nation? Obviously, I think it would make more sense to give it to the entire nation. So to keep this idea in the back of your head, because we're going to explore this as we go through history. We're going to try to see how events and things play out in history, and then we'll return back to this idea. So let's look at how history operates. In the world, there are generally, maybe there's more, but as far as I can tell, they're generally speaking 4 different types of historical claims. You have the types of claims that be one man, one witness, meaning one person saw it, and you either take that person's word for it or not. There are small group claims, and we'll explain this in a bit more depth in a second, but a small group could be 10, 15 people. Small group could be 1,000, 2,000 people. Could be 10,000 people, and we'll talk about that. Then there's national experience where an entire nation went through something, but it happened overseas. It didn't necessarily happen on their land, on their soil. And then there's the national experience that's up close and in person, something the entire nation went through together. So we're going to look at each one of these different claims. Then we're going to compare this to the Jewish national claim and try to see how it plays out with our story of the king, or maybe you being God. So here we go. We'll start with one man, one witness. This is a picture of Cleopatra. It's not actually a picture of Cleopatra. It's a picture of Elizabeth Taylor dressed up like Cleopatra. Okay. Anyways, does everybody know the story of Cleopatra, of her entrance onto the world stage? Probably not. So let me tell you. Go back to your high school history class when you're studying ancient Rome, And they had something called, this was the waning days of the Roman Republic. And you had the first triumphant. The first triumphant would have been Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus. So anyways, like all these things that played out in Rome, everybody's really ambitious and really intense. And so the first triumvirate wasn't destined to last for a very long time, but it was a ruling arrangement that they had, whatever. Crassus goes off to fight a war in Babylon, Persia, and he gets killed. So now you're just left with Caesar and Pompey the Great. Caesar was actually Pompey's father-in-law, but then Pompey's wife died and things were a little tense. Anyways, these are two men with Herculean ambition. And so it ended up leading to a civil war. Back in those days in Rome, you funded the army yourself. So they were loyal to you because you paid them. So it was a massive civil war. There was a massive naval battle. And Caesar won the battle. And Pompey fled to Alexandria, Egypt. Now, here's the deal. Pompey didn't know this. But when he goes to Alexandria, there happened to have been a similar power struggle going on between Ptolemy the 13th and his sister Cleopatra. And so Ptolemy says, you know what? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do Caesar a favor, and then Caesar is going to help me with my problem with my sister. So Pompey comes to Alexandria. He goes ashore. Ptolemy ambushes him, chops off his head, burns his body on the beach, pickles the head like a tomato, and waits. About a month later or so, I don't know the exact dates, Caesar shows up, and Ptolemy is like, hey, buddy, I've done you a favor. Here's your enemy. Needless to say, Caesar wasn't impressed. He cried, he kissed the head, and then he said to Ptolemy, I'm in charge now, bucko. And that was the end of Egyptian independence. They had become now, I guess they were already under Greek rule. The Ptolemies were Greeks, but they were now under Roman control. And this actually had major impact for history later on because of the overwhelming abundance of grain in Egypt. That's what fed the people on the streets in Rome, and blah, 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 blah. Anyways, that's the story. Here's the thing, though. Cleopatra said not so fast. So Caesar's in charge. He's hanging out in the palace. Her brother, I don't know, whatever. And so Cleopatra, she needs to get rid of her brother, and she wants Caesar on her side. So what she does is she has her servants roll her up in a rug, and they carry the rug into the palace. And then they unfurl the rug in front of Caesar, and she pops out, hey, big fella, slaughter any Gauls lately? Needless to say, Caesar is smitten. And one thing leads to another, and that's the end of the story. They had a child, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so did it happen? Did it happen? Is that really the way that Caesar and Cleopatra got together? Was she really smuggled into the palace with a rug? I don't know. It's one man, one witness. You could say they were servants, but in the ancient world, what kind of credibility does the servants really have? So can you imagine like Caesar's hanging out the next day at the officers club with the guys, you know, smoking a cigarette? Paisan, you know? You're not going to believe what happened last night. The queen, she was smuggled into my room in a rug, you know? Okay, so maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen. At the end of the day, it made the history books, and it's cute, but the only reason we accept it as history is because Caesar said it happened. We know that Egypt was in Rome. We know the economic impact and geopolitical significance of Egypt, of Rome being in Egypt, and of their dominance of the grain, like I said. We know that Caesar and Cleopatra got together, but how did they get together? Did they meet in some boring diplomatic meeting? You know, were they maybe at a dance? Was she really smuggled into the room in a rug? We don't know. One man, one witness. You could take it or leave it, whatever. That's the first type of historical claim. And there's gazillions of claims like this throughout history. Next, we would have what's called a small group claim. A small group claim, like I said, it's not an individual claim. It's a small group of people. It could be 10 people. It could be 1,000 people. It could be multiple thousands of people. So a small group has an advantage over a individual, where a small group, you have more witnesses. So since you have a small group, it's a lot more difficult to fudge, because by an individual, maybe I'm telling the truth, maybe I'm not. There's no way to prove it or disprove it. It's my word against yours. With a small group, I have other witnesses and other evidence, so it's much stronger, but there's an inherent weakness to a small group claim as well, which is that I can manipulate a small group of people. So I have here a picture of Jim Jones, and I will just tell you very quickly the stories of the Jim Jones massacre, because I think it helps illustrate it really helps illustrate the weakness of a small group really well. So Jim Jones, this is back in the 1960s. He was really a big player on the California scene, the California sort of hippie, spiritual, far left political scene. And he was, I don't know exactly what he was doing, but he was a pretty credible and known person at the time. He had a group, which was like a cult. It was called the People's Temple. They practiced something called apostolic socialism. I don't know what that is, but that's what they were into. But he was a well-known character. Later on in the story, when he started having problems, he got letters in his defense from people like really big-time Democratic leaders in the States at the time. People like Harvey Milk from San Francisco, who knew him. Walter Mondale, at that time, the vice president. Rosalind Carter, at that time, the first lady. So anyway, so he was a well-known character. Anyways, after a number of years of his group hanging out in Northern California, he decided, like most, Messianic doomsday cults, it was time to establish utopia. So they bought some property in Guyana. Guyana is a country on the northern coast of South America. It would be the southern coast of the Caribbean. And they bought a plot in the middle of the jungle. They named it Jonestown after Jim. And whatever, they're living there in the idyllic, wonderful lifestyle. There's about 1,000 people there. Great. Anyways, as you can imagine, when you're living in the jungle alone with 1,000 people, so things started to get a little bit weird. And there was a family there that was a husband and wife named Tim and Grace Stone, and they decided it was time to leave. So they were able to get out, but they had a son named John, and they couldn't get John out. Okay, Jones claims that John was his, and who knows? Anyways, so this couple were a little desperate, and so they took Jones to court in Guyana, and they won, but the Guyanese government was just terrified of Jones, so they were intimidated, and they didn't do anything. So now the family is really starting to panic, so they wrote letters to their members of Congress. They wrote letters to the State Department explaining their situation. Jones felt his reputation was being sullied, so he started writing letters to his members of Congress and to the State Department as well. And finally, one member of Congress, named was Leo Ryan. He was the congressman from that particular district where Jones was before he went to Guyana, where a lot of the people in the People's Temple were from. So he decides, I'm going to go and make a fact-finding mission. I'm going to go to Guyana. I'm going to try to talk with Jones, maybe get some of these people out, and we'll solve this problem, and gazang. So he goes down. It was about 15 people he went with. It was him and 4 people from his congressional office, and then the press. Is back in the old days when you had the 3 networks, when you had whatever. So you go down there. He spends the day. They had to fly into Georgetown, which is the capital of Guyana, and they had to take these Cessnas to get over to Jonestown. And they're very creative in how they named towns back then in Guyana. Anyway, so they take the Cessnas, and they spend the entire day with Jones and his group. They had a great meeting. Jones agreed to everything Leo Ryan suggested. And it was fantastic. Anyways, he's leaving with a few of the people. I don't know if he had John with them or not. I don't remember the whole story. But anyways, he's at the airstrip where he's getting on his Cessna to fly back to the capital to catch his plane back to America. And some goons who worked for Jones popped out of the jungle, opened fire. They murdered the congressman and 4 other people. Crazy. It's getting crazy. Then these goons, they make their way back to like the main grounds where Jones and the people were hanging out. And Jones is preaching, and he's saying, this is exactly what I warned you about. They're trying to steal our children. They're trying to destroy our way of life. And there's only one way we can protest, and that is revolutionary suicide. And so they took these massive vats filled with Kool-Aid. It's actually Flavor Aid, because in South America and back in those days, you couldn't get Kool-Aid, but they call it Kool-Aid. And they filled it with Kool-Aid and cyanide. This is where the expression drinking the Kool-Aid comes from. And anyways, whole families killed themselves. Jones shot himself in the head. At the end of the day, I think it was 908 people were dead. And it was the largest mass killing of Americans until 9/11, which is kind of insane. Meaning that with a small group, yeah, it's a stronger claim than a individual claim, but still a small group is a group, it's small enough that you can manipulate it. All right. Better than a small group claim would be what we call national experiences. And there's 2 types of national experiences that I want to focus on. There's here the national experience that happens away from home, and then the national experience that happens up close and in person. So I will start with a national experience that happens away from home. So I'll start with Vietnam. I'll give you two examples. The first one will be relatively recent. The next one will be ancient. So the first one's the Vietnam War. So how do you know the Vietnam War happened? How do you know it happened? So you know it happened. Well, there's plenty of footage and there's lots of news reports that went down. And I'm sure if you go to Vietnam, you could probably see some of the ruins and the old American bases, et cetera, and so forth. But that's not really how you know Vietnam happened. You know Vietnam happened because it was an event that changed the tenor of American culturally. It marked the rise of the left. It was the cause du jour at that time that people rallied around. And it changed everything. I remember as a kid, I'm old. So I remember back in the 1970s when I was a kid. So my grandparents, that generation was all in their 50s, like their relationship with like the government and the news, it was like this simple sort of patriotism, like there was no cynicism. That really died with Vietnam. Vietnam kind of changed everything. So everybody was sort of involved, right? Either you got drafted or you knew somebody was getting drafted, or you're afraid of getting drafted, or your name was entered into the lottery. You knew someone who died, or you heard of someone who died. Like the country knew about it, but very few people actually set foot in Vietnam. Yet we know Vietnam happened. How come? Because like I said, because it changed the tenor of the country. The entire feel of what it was like to live in America was different from before Vietnam than after Vietnam. So it was an event that affected the entire nation, even though most of the nation never actually experienced it. That's the point. And that's a national experience away from home, where the events themselves, even though you have other types of evidence, it's the historical experience of the nation going through that event that really sets the tone and gives the flavor and feel, but also sort of verifies the truth of the claim. Let me give you a more ancient one that I think makes the example a little bit stronger, which is Carthage. So Carthage, everybody knows, back to Rome. Sorry, so many Roman examples today. This is the last one. But if you remember back in your high school history class, there was something called the Punic Wars. It was 3 battles that were fought between Rome and the Carthaginians. Carthage was an upstart city-state on the northern coast, on the northern coast of Africa. I think it's like now modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, that area over there. And Carthage was the dominant economic power in the Mediterranean. Rome was this upstart city-state in the middle of the Italian peninsula. They started consolidating power in Italy, but they weren't a world power yet. The Punic Wars were 3 battles between Rome and Carthage, which, even though Rome it basically showed Rome that they were capable of becoming a world power. What happened? It showed Rome they were capable of, how do you explain it? It was really, we had these 3 battles. And Rome, they fought with Hannibal and the elephants, and it really led to this development of the Roman Navy. And basically, it changed the entire course of who Rome was and put them on the map. Now, what's amazing about Carthage is that if you look at the ruins from Carthage, modern-day archaeologists are extremely frustrated with how little they can learn about Carthage, because Rome dropped the ancient world equivalent of a nuclear bomb on Carthage. There was 3 wars. At the end of the 3rd war, Rome went in there and they killed every man. They sailed. They had now developed a navy. They sailed into Carthage. They killed every man, woman, and child. They tore down every building. They burnt the fleet in the harbor. They put salt in the ground so nothing could grow. Like there's nothing left of Carthage, So how do we know these wars happened? If Carthage was completely destroyed, there's nothing you can learn about it. We know Carthage happened because Rome told us it happened. It was defined Roman history. Knows every single event about the Punic Wars true? Like, did Cato the Elder really stand up in the Roman Senate and say, Carthage must be destroyed? Did Hannibal really come over the mountains with the elephants and attack? Maybe. We know Hannibal was a significant figure in Roman history. He's the only non-Roman who had a statue of him in the Roman Forum. So it was a major thing. But even if those events weren't necessarily true, we know the Punic Wars happened because they changed the whole course of Rome. It led to the development of their navy. It showed them they were capable of becoming a world power. And within the next few hundred years, they became a world power. This was the event that led to all that. So that's the point. Just like Vietnam, just like the Punic Wars, an event that happens away from home. Even we may not have footage and newsreels and newspaper articles and even archaeological evidence, but the event happened because the event was something a nation experienced en masse, even though it didn't happen on their soil. still it happened. It was strong enough that it became part of the historical record, and we know that it's true. The strongest type of claim, better than a national event that happens away from home, would be an event that happens up close and in person. So I usually use 9/11 as an example. As I find people are getting younger, maybe we'll use COVID. I don't know. But I'll start with the Kennedy assassination, because that's always a good place to start. So when I was a kid, I was born after the Kennedy assassination. Not that old. And so I was a kid growing up. So, the Kennedy assassination was something that loomed large culturally in the world that I grew up in. So it's actually kind of interesting how I know about it. And I think everybody, this is really an important point about understanding history. So all my friends, we all had similar stories. So my family, my story was like this. My parents hadn't met yet. And my mother's older sister got married that week. And I think Kennedy was killed on a Friday. And my aunt and uncle were married on that Sunday. So my mother, I remember her telling me all the stories about what happened with the assassination, where she was coming out of school, and she thought they were talking about the president of the school was shot, not the president of the United States. And then there was this funk hanging over the country. My aunt cried the whole weekend because it's her wedding and that the president got killed that morning, the morning of the wedding, which was Sunday. That's when Oswald got shot. And so what do you think everybody spoke about at the wedding? They're all speaking about the Kennedy assassination. So this was a major story in my family. My parents hadn't met yet. My father was in college, and he was going to college upstate in New York. So him and his fraternity brothers, they drove down from New York, Oswego on Lake, is it Erie? Let's say, yeah. They drove down to the funeral. My father sat on a statue of a lion and took pictures. And I've seen the pictures. Actually, it's pretty wild. And I found out as an adult that actually in the station wagon they took down to the funeral was a keg of beer, but they didn't talk about that when I was a kid. Anyways, point being like this. Every year when my family got together for Thanksgiving, my mother and her sister were very close. We always lived 15 minutes away from them. And so every year when we got together as a family, we always had this story. Talk about my aunt and uncle and how they got married and Kennedy got shot. And then my dad would say, and I drove down, I took pictures, I sat in a lion, and all these different things. Anyways, by the time I got to high school and I was sitting in a history class and I was learning about American history and they told us about the Kennedy assassination, it was old news. And guess what? All my friends, they all had similar stories. They didn't have the story of their aunt and uncle getting married. They had their own stories. In other words, a historical event that happens to a nation on its turf, it's all these different stories that are all really the same story. You can apply that to 9/11. Everybody knows where they were on 9/11, whether you were home, whether you were in New York, whether you were in California, whether you were flying that day. Everybody's got their own individual stories. They're all completely different, yet they're all the same because they're all telling the same story about the same event. And that's how historical events work, and that's how they make it into the historical record. Now, every single story about the historical event might not be true. There's conspiracy theories that develop around these things, and people will embellish and make them like they were bigger heroes than they necessarily were, or they'll say they were someplace where they were and they weren't actually there. But the bottom line, even if the stories are embellished and there's certain things that you could say about them that aren't true, or maybe some things that are true, still, at the end of the day, JFK was the day of your senior prom. Wow, that's pretty intense. All right, Sharon, that is pretty intense. Wow. Anyways, so even though there's things that we can say about the event that may not, even though there's embellishments, things people might say about the event that are not true, we know the event happened. That's the bottom line. The core event itself, you can't falsify because an entire nation is claiming this is history. Eventually, like the Punic Wars, you get so far away from the event that all the witnesses and their families and all those people are dead. But now it's a part of the historical record because it was something that a nation experienced en masse. It changed the course of destiny. It changed how that nation functioned and operated, changed how they saw themselves and how they defined themselves. It's part of the national experience. It might get embellished. There might be some mythology that develops around it. There might be some cool stories that get added to it. But ultimately, it's part of the historical record because the whole nation experienced it together. And that's how we know about things like 9/11, about the Kennedy assassination, and about the Punic Wars, and about whatever else we're going to talk about. So let's just go a little bit deeper into this now, because it's not just the number of people that saw the event that are relevant. There's also something else. Here's a picture of Betsy Ross. So I would normally say true or false, but I'll say like this. Did Betsy Ross sew the first American flag? Some people will say yes. Some people will say No. What's the real answer? The real answer is, who cares? There's a nice bridge named after her in Philadelphia. If you come from Cherry Hill, you can go over the bridge. But ultimately, at the end of the day, whether or not Betsy Ross was a real person who sewed the first American flag, or it was just a story that was fabricated in time for the first centennial in 1876, makes no real difference. It's a story. It's nice, it's cute, but if I could prove to you that Betsy Ross never existed, it would make no difference to your life whatsoever. My slide is missing, but I usually show a picture of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree. Is that true? Is it true that George Washington really cut down the cherry tree? Same thing. Like, who cares? Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. At the end of the day, it makes no real difference, right? There's no real consequence to the cherry tree or not. However, let's say we're talking about something like the American Revolution and the founding of the United States and the Constitution. So did that really happen? That we would have to say yes. How come? Because it's more than just the number of witnesses, more than just the number of people involved in the event. What's significant about the American Revolution is the impact or the implications of the event as well. Meaning, once we have an American Revolution, that leads to the founding of the United States and ultimately the Articles of Confederation and then the Constitution and then the whole history of the nation. If I could prove to you that there was never an American Revolution and the Constitution was written sometime in the 1800s and everything is a lie and there's no George Washington, it would completely undermine the fabric of the nation. So what's the point? The point is like this. It's not just the number of witnesses that are involved that make the event important and memorable and true. It's also the implications, the impact or the import of the event. It's similar to like what we said about Cleopatra and Caesar. Like, maybe she was smuggled in a rug. Maybe she wasn't. Who cares? It's a cute story. It's part of history. They tell it in the books. That's great. But we know for a fact that Rome and Egypt had a relationship and that Rome had conquered Egypt. And we know the impact and the implications of Roman control of Egypt. That kind of stuff you can't really fabricate because it changed the whole course of history. And if it wasn't true, Rome would be a very different place. Roman history would be very different and world history would be very different. Okay, there's one final example I'm going to give. And people often get mad at me, but don't get mad at me. I just ask you, be nice to me because I'm a nice person. But it just helps make this point really clear. How are you going to convince your grandchildren that the Holocaust really happened? Already today, most of the survivors are really old. By the time it's 50 years from now, all the survivors, unfortunately, will not be with us anymore. So how are you going to convince your children, the grandchildren, that the Holocaust really happened? So people will say, well, I'll show them the reels, the news footage and the BBC footage when they conquered the camps. I'll show them the interviews that Steven Spielberg put together with all the different survivors. I will take them to a Holocaust museum, or maybe I'll even take them on a tour of the camps. And those are all things that people do to show that the Holocaust really happened, except none of them are actually very good. And if you ever talk to a Holocaust denier will actually argue against all these points. And this is really what Holocaust deniers do. Holocaust deniers are not going to say there's never a Holocaust, nothing happened, there's no World War II. They'll say that there was a World War II, but you know what? The events weren't like you say they are. You know, they'll tell you that the BBC footage was contrived. You know, the hit interview, Steven Spielberg, he hired actors. He was a great director. He hired actors to play survivors. And if you visit the camps, you know, the camps aren't necessarily anything. You know, I remember, I'll tell you an interesting story. In 2006, I went on a tour of the camps with a group of 62 rabbis, because that's what you do when you work as a rabbi. And at the first camp we went to was Treblinka. And the next day, the rabbi who was leading the trip pointed out, did you notice there was actually nothing there? Treblinka was a lot of cement structures, a lot of really bad communist era art, but there's no evidence of mass murder. Same thing when we got to Majdanek. Majdanek was this massive, overwhelming place, but our tour guide explained to us that actually they reconstructed the buildings after the war because the Nazis had destroyed them, and they had built them wrong. So the gas chambers were on the wrong side of the building. Birkenau was pretty intense. That was original. But Auschwitz, this is a picture on my slide of Auschwitz. If you go to Auschwitz, so Auschwitz was built in the days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was built as military barracks. And that's what it looks like. if you were an archaeologist digging in the country formerly known as Poland 1,000 or 2,000 years from now, and you'd stumbled upon Auschwitz, it's unlikely that you would say this was a concentration camp or a site of mass murder. You might say it's a museum, or more likely, you're going to say that it is military barracks, probably built by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, by the Habsburgs, because that's exactly what it looks like. And like I was saying earlier, that's exactly what Holocaust deniers do. They take the truth and then they twist it and fabricate it to make it fit their narrative. So they'll say, of course the Nazis were terrible people, and of course there was a World War II. They were killing communists and political prisoners. Okay, so some Jews were communists, so they're going to kill them, but they weren't. It wasn't a mass slaughter. It wasn't like a genocide directed against the Jewish people. The Jewish people fabricated this whole thing to get sympathy in order to found the state of Israel. Okay, that's what they would say. Does that make you mad? Of course it should make you mad. And how do you know they're lying? You know they're lying because you don't need necessarily the evidence, the archaeological evidence, or the testimony from Steven Spielberg. You know it's true because it's our history. It's the history of the Jewish people. Every Jewish person was affected somehow by the Holocaust. Either you're a survivor or a child of survivors, or your family was already in, say, the United States and they fought in the War of Liberation, or you were living, say, in North Africa or Israel or somewhere else in the Middle East, terrified the Nazis were going to be successful and make their way over. Wherever you were, the Holocaust affected and impacted you. It defined the next 70 plus years of Jewish history. It did help lead to the foundation of the state of Israel, and it's a major event that transformed and defined the Jewish people. We know that it happened because it's our history. If you ever read, and this is really fascinating, if you read accounts or speak to survivors, I've had, just over the years, I've probably heard 10, 15 survivors speak, and I've also read a number of accounts of people's firsthand experiences of the Holocaust, whether it's people like Eli Wiesel's book Night, or Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, or Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Any of these books, you read them, you'll notice they're all completely different, but they're all exactly the same. It starts with the war, and it starts with them getting into the camps, and the whole thing crescendos to a certain point, and then to their liberation, how they got out. They're all telling different stories that are all the same story. Could somebody be making something out? For sure. But it's all telling the same story. I'll tell you a wild story. Once I was giving this talk in California, and the synagogue I was speaking at was adjacent to an old age home. And so 4 of the old people from the old age home came to my talk. They're all survivors. And after the class, the rabbi took me out for dinner. And he was telling me, there was 4 survivors there. 3 of them don't, even though they all tell the same story, 3 of them don't talk to the 4th. How come? Because he was probably a capo, which is wild. Meaning he wouldn't tell you that story. He fabricated his experience and made something different. But other people had different opinions about what he did and what he was up to during his experience of the war. Meaning that every story may not be true. Every story may not be exact, but the war happened. Meaning in national history, you can't fake. You can maybe fabricate some of the individual details, but you can't fabricate the experience, because the experience is what it is. Okay, so what about the Jewish historical experience? What is the Jewish claim? What happened at Mount Sinai? So if you look at the Jewish historical claim, so you'll know, and here's a picture of Moses. This is a very accurate and real picture. Not sure why these people this guy's not wearing a yarmulke over in the corner here, but okay, it's not our business right now. Anyway, so what is the historical experience? The Jewish claim, and this is kind of wild, is that the Jewish nation was gathered en masse at the base of Mount Sinai, and God spoke to the nation and gave them the Torah. That is the experience of the Jewish people. They had done a census beforehand. The census was, I think, 603,550 men who were of fighting age, meaning 20 or older, plus their wives and children. So you're talking somewhere between 2, maybe 3 million people there. So it was a national experience. And similar to our examples of, say, Betsy Ross, American Revolution, it wasn't just a fun story. It was an experience that a nation experienced en masse that defined the Jewish people. It meant that the 7 wonders of Jewish history, that course of destiny, which is so unique and anomalous and terrifying, that's going to happen to you. It meant that you can no longer eat cheeseburgers. It meant you're not going to work on Saturday anymore. Like, there's so many implications to this experience. So That said, that should be enough. Now, did every single event that we talk about at Mount Sinai happen? I don't know. You read like rabbinic literature, you'll hear they talked about how when God spoke, everybody died, then they came back to life, or how the desert bloomed. Maybe that happened. Maybe it didn't happen. I don't know. But in terms of having the quality of a national claim that happened to that nation up close and in person, it fits all the requirements. So that said, that should be enough for us. That's the historical proof. Woo! Except you're probably bothered. And you're probably bothered because it's a little weird. It's supernatural. So here is a claim that the Torah makes. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 32 and 33. And this claim goes back to the original story I told you at the beginning about the king. If you and God, if you had the ability to give your Torah to an entire nation, your book to an entire nation, would you give it to the entire nation, or to an individual prophet? Let's read this quote and then discuss it a little bit. So the quote says like this: "You might inquire about times long past, from the day that God created man and earth, exploring one end of heaven to the other. Has there ever been anything like this great thing, or has anything like it been heard? Has the people ever heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fires as you have, and survived?" So the Torah is making two relatively audacious claims. Claim number one, and you can show me back on the screen if you want. Claim number one is that this event that happened will never happen again. And you could argue, okay, maybe it's a little bit of a cop-out, like they got away with it once, but you're never going to get away with it again. But then there's the second claim, and the second claim is really the clincher. The second claim is, not only will this never happen again, but no one will ever even make this claim. Now the Torah is going on a limb. We said at the beginning, if you were God, you would give your book to a group of people. If you were the king, you'd appear to all three brothers, or maybe even the whole palace. Why would you give it to an individual when you can give it to everybody? It makes sense, because the more witnesses, the more credibility, more believable your story is. And since this is the basis of your people, you should give to as many people as possible. And yet, if you go and you look throughout history, you will find that the Jewish people are the only one who have made this claim. And the Torah is telling you from the outset, not only will this never happen again, but nobody will ever even claim that this happened to them. Well, why not? What about the Christians? What about the Muslims? These are not stupid people. Why didn't St. Paul, who's really the father and inventor of Christianity, why did he say, don't you guys remember back in the day when Jesus took us outside Jerusalem and brought us into the desert, and he revealed himself to us? He said, there's a New Testament now. It supersedes the old, and I'm the Lamb, and whatever other stuff it is. Why did he do that? Why did Muhammad, who was living out there in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula, why didn't he say, don't you guys remember when Allah appeared to us outside Mecca? Or that story you heard from your great-grandparents about 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, when Allah appeared to all of us outside Mecca and he gave us this Quran and said that I'm the seal of the prophets and there's a new show in town? Why didn't they do this? If the Jewish people could fabricate a claim like this and get away with it, couldn't everybody fabricate a claim and get away with it? And we all know it's the best claim. Why are these belief systems still relying on an individual prophet making an individual claim? And the reason why they do that, because you can only make a national claim if a national claim actually happened. If you could fake it, everybody would fake it. But you can't fake it because there's too many people saying, I never heard this. This wasn't the story that was passed down to my family. Nobody ever talked about this before. What are you talking about? And what? And now that since I believe the story, I can't eat cheeseburgers anymore? Or I've got to believe these 10 commandments? Or I got to wear this outfit or whatever? It doesn't make any sense. In other words, you can only claim a national claim if you actually had a national claim, which is why the Torah can go out on a limb and make this audacious claim that not only will this never happen again, but nobody will ever even claim that it happened to them, because you can't claim it unless it really happened. If it didn't happen, you have to come up with some other way. Now, your leaders and people may be credible, may be wonderful people. They may even be telling the truth, but you can't verify it the way you can verify a national claim. That brings us to our final idea, which is that I may be able to convince you that something happened to me, but I can't convince you that something happened to you. So I'll give you an example. Let's pretend I'm sitting right here and I walk to the side of the screen. I walk up the screen and all of a sudden the sky opens up and this big spaceship comes out of the sky and it sucks me into the spaceship. and it takes me warp speed across the galaxy, the universe, to planet Zorkon. And I'm sitting there in Zorkon, these aliens with thousands of eyes are sticking needles in me and doing these tests. They take me to Zorkon, throw me in a zoo, and I sit in the zoo and I live there for 1,000 years. Anyways, 1,000 years go by. There's a revolution on the planet, and the Society for the Society of People for something against cruelty to animals. They win the revolution, and they free all the animals from the zoo, and they put me back on the spaceship and send me back across the galaxy from planet Zorkon, and I land back here on this room, and I walk out. It's 2 minutes later, and I'm like, "You're never gonna believe what happened to me." Did it happen? Do you know what happened? Do you believe me? I show you the tracks on my arm from the tests they did. I show you the 1,000 years of aging on my skin. I smell like the planet. Do you believe me? Maybe. If I'm a really trustworthy and I'm kind of your hero and I've never lied to you and I'm able to give you all this evidence, maybe you'll believe me. Why not? Maybe you'll believe me. Now, same story. Can I convince you that you were on the spaceship with me? We went together to Zorkon. We lived together in the zoo. It's impossible. Maybe I could beat you and electrocute you and give you drugs and convince you like in 1984, right? When the guy convinced him 2 + 2 is 5 and showed him the fingers. Maybe it was 1 + 1 is 3. I can't remember now. Maybe I could do that. Could I do that to an entire nation? Could I manipulate and beat an entire nation into submission? It's impossible. That's it. I convince you something happened to me. I can't convince you that something happened to you. And that's the strength of the national claim, which is why the Torah goes out on a limb and makes this statement that this will not only never happen again, but no nation will ever claim that it happened to them, because you can only make a national claim if you actually had a national experience. And that, my friends, is this presentation. I can take a bunch of questions now if people have questions. And if you don't, I've got more stuff we can do, whatever you want. Adam, if you want to come on and ask me some questions, that'd be great. Whatever you guys want. How was that?
That was awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Very clear and very interesting. And while we wait for questions to come in, do you mind if I ask you like a really controversial question on this topic?
I probably will just blow it off, but
That's fine. That's fine. I'm not claiming to have the answer, but there are those who claim that the Palestinian national history is not necessarily accurate. They have an identity, right? They have a set of beliefs as to how they came to be. They've been there since time immemorial. But for those who say, it's really more of a conglomeration of people who were living around or near the land at the time, and it was only in the last number of decades that it congealed into like what we call the Palestinian national identity today. Is that possibly an example of people accepting a false history? That they came to believe over time?
It's an excellent question. And
thank you.
Anytime. I'm here for you. I mean, there's a few problems with it. The obvious major problem is that there's so much evidence against it. You find with these national claims, like the Torah claim, you'll find that you don't really have arguments against it until really much, much later. Even much later in Jewish history, the major groups that were battling within the Jewish people against the establishment were still accepting the truth of this claim. They were arguing against, say, the authority of the rabbis and against culture, the way things had evolved. But in terms of the basic claim, it was part of the national experience and part of the history that everybody accepted because it was their history. The Palestinian national claim, so you have to start to start asking questions. What actually is the claim? If you and I don't want to get political, so that's why I'm kind of hedging a little bit.
Me neither.
But if you have to start. So, what was the name of the leader who was deposed at the time of the revolution? What was the name of the what was the currency that they used? What were the nation's boundaries? What was the name of the national governing body? Like, as soon as you start picking apart the story, there's no actual evidence that it really happened. And especially if you start looking at the history beforehand. there's really nothing there. And then you have to start asking, what are the people actually believing? And is there credibility to that? And who are the witnesses for this national claim? Where's that coming from? I think it varies a little bit from from this claim. Does that help? I don't know. I'm trying to say it. Yeah.
I think it does. Well, I mean, I think what you're saying is that it's possible to come to believe a false history. However, if there's no events, if there's no, if you scratch the surface and you don't find anything, then you at least you have some way of determining it. Yes, people can believe all kinds of things, but and including false history. Nonetheless, if evidence exists that it's not true, then it's not true.
I would say yeah. And it's, and what is the history that they're claiming that forms the national narrative, that forms the national identity? It's a little bit problematic. Are there questions? Do people have questions for us?
You may have perfectly explained it. Here you go.
I'm pretty good. Who are the ones that can trace their lineage to Ishmael? So Ishmael is the father of the Arab peoples. According to Jewish tradition, Abraham it's the Bible. I mean, it's not really Jewish tradition. I guess it is. Abraham had two sons. He had Isaac and Ishmael. And according to Jewish tradition, Ishmael is the father of the Ishmaelites, who the Arabs claim, the Arab people, meaning the people from the Arabian Peninsula, claim is their ancestor. And that is consistent with the Quran, so much so that when the Quran re-explains the biblical story, so to speak, like, say, the famous story of the binding of Isaac, it's the binding of Ishmael, and so the Arabs claim to be the descendants of Ishmael. I don't know if we would argue with that. Are they literally the descendants of Ishmael? Are they mystically? Is there something like on a mystical level that makes them the sense of that? I don't think we would argue with them on that. But yeah, that's who they are. Okay. That's who they are. They would be the modern. It's what's interesting about Ishmael and his descendants. They have really conquered they've colonized, from the times of the Arab conquest in the 7th century and onward. They conquered, most of North Africa, the Middle East, extending as far into India and even into the South Pacific. They definitely had some long tentacles. And a lot of people are Arabic speakers, especially, in the Maghreb, throughout North Africa and in the Middle East. But still, those people aren't necessarily indigenously Arab. Arabs are people from the Arabian Peninsula. I don't know what that has to do with our talk, but okay.
But it was important to say it.
It's important to say it. I could go on. You want me to do more tough stuff? You want
no?
More class?
I think we'll wrap it up. And if people want to add questions to YouTube, we will collate those and send them to Rabbi Gluckin this week, and you can get your question answered. In the meantime, we are going to be moving on next week, a week from today, to part 4 of Discovery. This is the 4th part out of 5. I hope by the time we are done, you will see that it is a very thorough and convincing presentation. And there's still a lot of fascinating material to go through. So please join us for the next 2 weeks. And to Rabbi Gluckin, thank you so much for joining us this week. Great as always. And we will look forward to seeing you all next week.
You're all beautiful. Thank you so much.